Johanna Son is editor-in-chief of Reporting ASEAN. Okay, this is a Bangkok-based independent news site that does a series of analysis and conversations about what is happening within the ASEAN region. Johanna is actually joining us from Bangkok. Johanna has written several tools for reporting and analysis, and the latest, timely enough, is an October 2022 release of a tool called Reporting on a Stressed Planet, 16 Concepts. As the founder and editor of Reporting ASEAN, Johanna is someone who has been covering sustainability, development, diplomacy in Southeast Asia. And today she'll be talking to us about how to connect some dots across usually separate news topics so that we can enrich and strengthen our climate reporting and come up with those solutions that are badly needed and urgently needed by the community, by our communities. Johanna?
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Yeah. Shall I share my screen or you're showing it? You're showing it?
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll just a second. Okay. Yeah. So the first slide is really, apart from the intro thing, I wanted to kind of show a bit of like how wide the topic actually is. I mean, so within, if we think of climate change, then as a concentric circles, you have this other, it's connected to and it's inside a lot of issues. And the clear one is a word that we hear often these days, which is sustainability. And if you look at some of the screenshots on the right, it shows you a couple of possibilities which maybe we don't instantly or as quickly identify with issues of like a stressed planet and climate change, which is that it has things to do with the way we live, what we call development, the way we consume things, and then also in some cases historical trauma, meaning including things like the loss of lands by cultural communities, for example, and then the value that we put on human life, on community life, and planetary existence. And if you see, business also has increasingly been going the way of sustainability and actually also being involved in disaster management, resilience, and thinking about the future. And this one, when rain turns to dust, shows you one intersection between climate change and conflict. So it's, to me, although Jeff did say that the challenge sometimes is that it's not seen as a gut issue, perhaps the challenge to us is how to show that it is. It's just that I think when you use the word, or you use the phrase climate change, it seems so big and huge and like unreachable, something out there. But I think, as I've said also in other workshops, climate change is the present tense, right? It is something that is already here. So yeah, if you go to the next slide, by coincidence, Jeff also used the word like connect the dots, and I was thinking actually that it's probably what storytelling tries to do. And I think what Jeff's work showed us, I think, is like many of these are events, right? They are what happened. But I think the consequences of that and the causes of those have a lot of stories for us to explore. So first I wanted to try to situate climate change not alone or separate to many of the problems that are connected to how human beings live. And basically how human beings define development and progress and maybe improvement since, I would say, more or less after the Second World War, meaning that this time of peace, right, saw a lot of development around the world, and all the countries seem mostly are following the same path. So in this path are included things have to do with what we eat, how we produce our food, how we construct our homes, how we build our offices, how we define like what is a good place to be in, perhaps, or where people want to go, and what is of value. And I think that the sustainability lens, if you want to call it that, offers a lot of possibilities for looking at news angles that may be not so obvious, but I think they do exist. And a lot of news organizations now they have somebody called like even a sustainability focused desk or series or person, or even climate reporting per se within that. Because I think the climate change topic cannot be disconnected from the large sustainability one, especially if you just look at one example, for example, maybe is that if we talk about rising temperatures, you connect it to the use of fossil fuels, right? Which is related to how we define development, and the effects are clearly there. It's just that sometimes it's not very linear. It's not like one cause, one effect. And it doesn't always happen like the huge storms that you see clearly what happened like in 1 or 2 days or even in a few minutes. So if you look at the sustainability thing as a challenge, I think my own definition is that it's a way of living that does not lead to our own and our planet's destruction. And sometimes I think when we say planet, it sounds so far from, for example, the community, one of the communities that Jeff showed. But actually, there is a relationship. If you also look at, for example, he talked about the connection between climate change and, for example, the storms, which in some groups they still question actually. But when global temperatures rise and when sea temperatures, ocean temperatures rise, the storms are able to the old storms that we know as Filipinos, they're able to pack much more power and moisture. And when they release that on landfall, the destruction tends to be so much higher. So, and then you see this is why this is a part of like why these things are happening. And I think that many of the issues around us today, including some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, be it your shopping habit, your eating habit, your agriculture, your decision to build a house here, and what is where to move, for example, all of this show that this question of sustainability is actually, how do I say, it has its fingerprints all over the place. It's just that sometimes we need that extra effort and that sharper lens to show the people this is where the fingerprint is and this is why it matters. From the point of view of what happens to the Philippines after the storms, it could also be that if people understood it better, then there's much more, how do I say, it becomes much more of a public issue and an accountability thing that we should be able to demand of the government, for example. So that's one way you could look at like why the story is important, not just from a human perspective, although of course it's important. So it can stem from what became a disaster, but it is wider than a disaster story, to put it that way. And actually, the stories are no longer just stories, how do I say, they are not just impersonal stories to journalists, because whether you're in the Philippines or in Thailand or in Myanmar or in the States, it does affect everybody's lives already. Next, please. Yeah. So, yeah, some of these reports, I think, for example, Groundswell, I heard Maureen mention, there are more and more resources out there, I think, that we can use to connect to even a very local story. And so sustainability is a big word. In many cases, it's overused or people mean different things because it's also a buzzword in business. for example, among others. But I think at its core, many of the climate related events that we're seeing, including those that lead people to decide to leave or to stay, has to do with the relationship, our relationship, human beings' relationship with the living world. Meaning, are we owners? Are we caretakers? Are we conscious of the fact that human beings are just one species of many? That it is not that the world exists to serve us, and corollarily, that it is not a given that human beings will never become extinct, if you really think about it. And climate change and the problems that what it does to the planetary balance, it's this one that we're seeing in our lifetime is not the only time it's happened. When I was doing the reporting tool on sustainability, it does give you some climate anxiety, because when you read that this is now the sixth extinction, so you think what happened to the previous ones, right? And there are a few that happened because of changed climate. Either it became too cold or it became too hot. So no, I think that if you come from this space that, okay, this is what's happening, and we cannot assume many of the assumptions that we thought were such, right? And that includes also our relationships with our communities and our homes, and like our decisions regarding those things, especially because we are focusing today on the migration aspect. Next, please. Yeah, so I tried to kind of think about climate. Usually it's climate crisis or climate emergency, which I think is a better phrase these days maybe. And then we look at migration. And I think it's causing people, whether at the individual or the community level, to do some things differently. In some cases, it's very drastic. In some cases, it's smaller, but it's also obvious. Like at home, maybe like you no longer, let's say you no longer go to the balcony because it's too hot, or you decide to move your bedroom from one place to another because it's become something else. So you could magnify that situation many times over in many other situations. But what it means is that there are very few people, I think, who have no experience of that in some way, even if sometimes they're not very aware of it. So if you only thought of the climate crisis on its own, right? The typical stories probably that you read or can think about or wonder about is the target setting, like what happened at COP27, like how far will countries go, how much can they promise in their decarbonization plans. There is a tendency, if you focus only on that, to atomize the topic to numbers, like it's a mathematical equation, which it is not. And in any case, the world is not anywhere closer to definitely not meeting 2 degrees increase in temperature, or even 1.5. So you come to actually what's been happening, it's been years. This is the 27th Conference of Parties, right? Which means they've been meeting every year for 27 years. During those 27 years, they've agreed on target this, target that. But the warming continues. And the point is that the figures for carbon use globally have not fallen. They have not remained static either. So this is it's kind of like we tried to do this and that, but we're all still moving towards this very bad scenario. And yes, we know extreme weather events and that we are feeling these changes. We notice them. And the phrase natural disasters, which is already, I think, has a different meaning today. Because first, actually, nature's also changed, right? And the definition of disasters has also unchanged. You could now step back from that very, in a sense, more restricted meaning or limited lens to one that can ask bigger, why? What do we value as human beings, right? And then how do we change habits and the ways that we have chosen to live? How do we define vulnerability and capacity to deal with disasters and emergencies? And what I said earlier is our relationship to this natural environment of ours. If we go to migration, in the Philippine context, migration is usually seen as migration for work. But in this case, we really just mean, as Maureen was explaining, the movement of people for whatever reason. And I put climate refugees in phrases. It's a phrase we have heard years back when we didn't see the effects as well. But maybe it is indeed such or climate migration of some sort. And behind, I think, the instant hook of migration in the Philippine news context, which is around, for example, OFWs and that kind of thing, there are larger questions such as what is changing in people's perceptions of their homes, either to make them leave or make them return, or not make or choose or make them choose not to return. Because I think in many of the examples that Jeff showed, what has happened is that their relationship with their home has changed, right? And at one level, it is physical, but it is really more than that. And as human beings, I think that is the human, very human story that cannot be removed from such things. And then how is climate change, or how does, for example, a disaster begin to shape your calculations of what is good for you and for your family, right? And for your community. I think also that for different reasons, it might be interesting to look even qualitatively at whether there are people who include experiences such as the storms, or let's say they live close to the sea, or they know somebody who has lost family members or homes to disasters, that they begin to consider it a metric in I suppose when you migrate, you have a couple of factors. And then maybe because of these things that are happening in different parts of the Philippines, maybe it's also like becoming one in that list that people are, maybe they don't always say it, but I think it's probably there. Yeah. Next. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I kind of make the argument that climate change, and in this case related to migration, sustainability, it's really a multi-bit story. It's actually for almost all journalists, I'd like to think. You can be a health journalist, you can be a disaster coverage person, you can be an economics person, you can be a labor person. But I think that it is very few things probably that are not affected by something that is as, how do I say, as impactful and as wide as climate change, because it changes the nature of our world. Actually, it's not just about one thing or two. And then I think as news persons and storytellers, whether we are influencers or other kinds of information creators, what in effect we're trying to do, I think, is to translate policy and things that you cannot touch, right, into things that we can understand, and that every can be told in everyday language. And sometimes we don't need to get lost in the terms. Like, we don't even probably have to say climate refugees. We don't even have to pepper the article or the report with too much of technical stuff, but still say what's happening, perhaps. So I think some of the entry points can be description, and then you add to it the solid analysis, which can come from quality sources. So there can be a lot of local voices, and then there can be others that maybe try to explain what happened, so that people also have a grasp on, okay, what does this mean? Okay, for them, but what does it also mean for me? And what could it mean for, you could make that bigger, like your country, for example. And I think that statistics play a huge role in this kind of storytelling, because I think Jeff also mentioned that sometimes it's a challenge to go back. But I think the more that we connect these dots, whether it is across time, across certain locations, or within certain parts of the country, for example, um, I think the more it becomes obvious to people why it is not just a problem of, for example, the coastal communities. Actually, cities are very much vulnerable to the impacts too. So actually, nobody's exempt from it, because in essence, what has happened is that human beings have broken the laws of nature. They have upset the laws of nature so that this is happening. So I wanted to show a few of actual samples, because I mean, I keep these links when I find them, because they're interesting, and there are different ways of looking at something that can be too huge. No, you say climate change, it's planetary. But okay, so for example, if you look at these examples, this one is rather new. So in the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam there are many issues around it. There is salinity, that's why creeping salt water. Many of these are shaped not only by the changes in climate, but definitely, clearly, I think, made much worse by it. So now people are starting to leave, or people have been leaving. So that's one kind of migration. On the top right, if you Tuvalu is a Pacific Island nation, and the Pacific Islanders have been saying for a long time that they're going to be the first to go underwater, which is already happening. So if you people, they're allowed to speak at the conference of parties, etc., etc. But the point is that these are already truth to them. And if you look at the headline, they are now trying to document what their country really looks like, because one day it will disappear. So that's why they say they move to. So they're going to create a digital Tuvalu. So you could call it like, this is like one extreme, maybe it's not extreme actually, because many people are already living like at huge scales. They have a plan for which community goes first, and some are already moving. Next, please. Yeah, so it's like, so you say, how do you move a country, right? And if you skim through what I showed on the right, I saw also a video by somebody in Fiji explaining that when you say that, okay, the water is rising and it's destroying our fields, our houses, it's not just that. They have to, she said, but what about our dead? In this case, he was showing like a cemetery, and he said that it means leaving part of your identity. So that's why I'm saying that it's not only the physicality of it, but it's the importance of this whole place. And the video was like near a graveyard kind of thing. So there is that culture that's lost too, not to mention history. Next one. And then there are other examples. I mean, on the top right is like, there are reports that increasingly talk about, put numbers on, like, and they make projections that I think are useful, and especially in some cases, if you don't find it easy to get information to the Philippine government, there's much more now online globally that you can take from. And then on the top right, I stumbled on this story in the New York Times, which I found, maybe other communities one day will think of, is that climate, they're like looking at how disaster prone is a place before they decide to move there. So this is kind of the destination driven, if rather than the one that post typhoon, which is like, where do you live? And this is like, where do you go? And some of the quotes inside were from people who said that, I'm tired. I can't do this again. I mean, you mean that we're going to be like over 70 and they will have to worry about having to rebuild a house. That's the kind of thing that they think about. The last one is, if you closer to us, closer to the Philippines, is Indonesia's decision to move the capital to Borneo. And part of the calculation in doing that, yeah, of course they talk about smart city and all of that stuff. But part of that is that you could call it, to me, it sounds in a way like a decision that they have kind of said, okay, we've reached the maximum. You probably cannot press the rewind button anymore. Congestion, pollution, the floods, and also rising sea levels, because Jakarta's very low. Like Thailand Bangkok are also very low. So people are used to high tide floods. But yeah, there are other things to deal with. So it is a very real factor, whether at the individual level or the community or the country level. Yeah. Next slide. So I think, yes, so I think more than just what happened, which tends to, of course, make the headlines and all of that, but I think there are probably too many examples in the Philippines of things that like you can use. Because I mean, while listening to Jeff, I was writing down notes about what could be interesting to look at. There are many potential entry points in what he was showing us. And then I think it's a good area to go do what you call enterprise reporting, your own. So you kind of separate from the obvious ones, or you don't need to wait for, let's say, a briefing from Pag-asa or even from IOM for that matter to go looking for some of these things. And then since COVID, one of the more interesting things for news is that what used to be out of reach, global news conferences or global reporting launches or regional discussions, now they are really just there. So you have a lot more resources to make the context, to give the context to what might at the start be a purely local story. And also I suggest not to sign up for newsletters of some of the things I'll show you later, but whether they are publications or sources of data, or even climate change related sites and migration sites, migration NGOs, migration research, for example, places, because at some point there's always something, and then you kind of know that you can go back to these, whether to interview or to get some data. And I think reading not just Philippine stuff, when you start reading those other things, then I will speak for myself, is that when I read the Philippine stories, or when, for example, even just listening to Jeff, it strikes me that, this one, this interesting, is different, or there's something clearly, I hate to use the word, but it's kind of like, in a sense, the Philippines like a laboratory for it, and not a very encouraging one, perhaps we can say, but because it's a country that's very used to typhoons, but the typhoons are no longer the ones that we know, right? So if some of the figures, for example, I've found, which are some of these, like, so temperature rise, which is actually interesting. So which means that it is not fiction, it is not a theory, and that every country has actually documented data like this, and that it's not your imagination, that yes, there are more extreme weather events. And on top, this was, I think, from the same report, from Groundswell. So they made projections of, like, if certain conditions happen, how many people will have to leave. This is from the lower Mekong region, because the region is quite integrated. But I think that even if you ask qualitatively first, what reaches the news also becomes useful for the larger community, for development agencies, for researchers, and then it's a way to reach policymakers as well. Next, please. Yeah, so I'm here again, as I typically do in events, to say that data is really, really important. there are many dashboards and trackers that are public, online. So a really, really good one has been Our World in Data. They recently updated their figures on, I think, per capita CO2. And you can like select which countries you want. So if you wanted to compare the Philippines with Southeast Asia. And I think the numbers are important because, if you look at just the Philippine examples, you might say, yeah, but it's the Philippines, but these are typhoons. But then when you start to put the Philippines in comparison with its neighbors, then you begin to see that we have a real problem here. And it's like an ongoing disaster chain that's been happening in the Philippines. It strikes you even more that there is a story in here. Um, and I think that the global reports now are all accessible. You need a little time just to go into it, but I promise you that there are lots of things that you can use even for a local story. I mentioned here the Global Climate Shift Index because it's new, very new. But what they did was that it's a visual map, and the most dark red parts are the countries where the cities average daily temperature has been changing a lot over the years. So it's a shift index because they measure the difference from the norm, if you put it that way. And if you see which are the big ones, it includes the Philippines too. So the Philippines, if you look at the map, is dark red. And I think that it's a way of, how do I say, also pushing for better attention, not just by the state, but including the state, of this whole issue as it's not a natural disaster often. I'll give a concrete example later. And then climate change is also an indicator in what we call sustainable development goals, right? All the countries have agreed that this is one indicator of development. So in the SDG progress report, they rate the countries by climate change performance, for example. You can also find statistics for migration rates, actually, among others. The Economist also has pretty good data viz information. In the Reporting ASEAN site, we like to do like Southeast Asia focused ones because I mean, what's the point of comparing the Philippines to Belgium, right? I mean, I think we should compare ourselves to the community. And so, yeah, and then the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center also has a lot of data. In their recent report on disaster and vulnerability assessments, the Philippines comes out on top in terms of they look at the physical risk, meaning archipelago, waters all around, equator, how many people living on the coast. So there's that natural, meaning geographically defined factors, and then they have the disaster coping, planning, and vulnerability factor, which is actually very low for the Philippines. And then there maybe are also Philippine government data, if not from the state, from other projects or that work on development and climate change or disaster work. Next slide. As I want to show you, yeah. So we're not talking about children, but this is one example of how data was crunched by connecting, assessing countries in terms of the environment. I don't mean physical environment, the context and realities for a child in a climate affected society. And you see the Philippines ranks very poorly actually. So here they look at development, if you want to call it that, right? And vulnerabilities plus the environmental stresses. So what does that do to quality of life? Then you can extend it more. What does that mean for human development, right? So in that sense, it's not just the moving part, not just the mobility part. So in here, this was a global index. So we pulled out the Southeast Asian one. Next slide, please. Yeah, so a bit more on the Philippines. This we did recently had a story on the Philippine aspects of a survey released earlier this year, which is done every year. It's called the Climate Outlook Survey by a regional think tank in Singapore. And if you, I won't read all of that, but what stands out in that survey and has done so for the last few years is that tends to be Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam have very high worry rates about climate change. So I think that um, it's somewhere there. I think no, it's probably top of mind in many cases. I think that the way or even our reaction to news of a typhoon coming has changed. It used to be that, I mean, like here when they say, "Oh, there's a typhoon," I say, "Yeah, but I'm from the Philippines. I'm used to this typhoon thing." But now it's changed. It's like when I hear Islam, is it bad? How bad is it? And, it's like we know that it is potentially big trouble these days. And so you see this figure that the Philippine respondents expressed the highest rate of worry in the region. But the thing is, they were also the most mistaken about whether the Philippines had a net zero target. And we don't. And you see who is in the same club. It's only Myanmar. And Myanmar is in conflict, apparently. And the most recent country to put out a date to commit to a date was Cambodia. And so I think it raises a lot of questions. I mean, things like in the elections, it wasn't really a topic. And I think for a country like the Philippines, it should be. So I think there's space for us to bring it higher in the policy making and political level, if you want to call it that. And that right is something that I think Maureen has talked about. And this index is not new, but they also explained that they had to change their definition of um, vulnerability and risk. So it's no longer where your country is or the nature of your geography and things like that. It really also measures, if you look at the visual, susceptibility, lack of coping strategies, and lack of adaptive strategies. And the Philippines ranks very poorly. You look at the last one, which country ranked highest in the 5 risk elements? Exposure and sustainability, the Philippines. Myanmar is high because of the vulnerability, but the Philippines doesn't do too well. That's why if you combine the two, it's not a very confidence building recipe, one could say. And in 2021, the figures for displacement were huge, but the biggest displacements were globally were in the Philippines due to disasters, which are climate related. So the biggest displacement due to conflict, not surprisingly, was Myanmar in the region, but for all other things, it's the Philippines. Next slide, please. So, I mean, I make the argument that the language of news, even just from reading news that is not obviously scientific, if you want to call it that, or not even obviously about migration, that many topics now will cross or touch on this issue of the changing physical environment around us. And so it's infiltrated the language of daily news. So, I mean, I thought that it was a natural thing that began to interest me to look at what some of these terms mean, because I'm saying that we need to understand what these are so that we can think of stories or make connections or ask questions. And they are not just for the scientists, they are not for the environment journalist only, not for the climate reporter only, definitely. But I think there are terms that are, if you often read 6 extinction. You read, for example, noise pollution or even extreme weather and the difference between weather and climate and things like that, so that you use them correctly and you can ask the right questions around, even, for example, let's say around a particular typhoon experience, for example, in the Philippines. I think it also gives you a degree of independence when you have an event or an issue, and then you have, for example, statistics and other experts that you talk to, when you kind of bring them all together and combine them, then they begin to tell people, hopefully, not only what happened, but why it happened, the meaning of what it happens, and what it means for you. So I put the link if you're interested. So these are not, because they are not dictionary definitions at all. They are some of the terms in the cover, like you see, blue economy. We read, we hear about this a lot. Decarbonization. They talk about so each term describes. It's like a news brief actually, to get you not only about what it means, but some of the debates around it. For example, that net zero is not zero is what advocates say. So what is the controversy and what is the debate? So that I think it's useful to anybody who uses or wants to, they have a degree of comfort around like working with some of these things. So I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for your sharing. There were so many things that the three of you shared, you, Maureen, and Jeff. I know I was taking down so much notes, and the things that cut across your three presentations were that one, we should call it climate emergency, to give it the kind of urgency and attention that it needs. But everything is more. It's more frequent, it's more severe. The effects are lasting longer, or, grammatically, it's lingering. Whether you live in a flooded area for days or months, or you are now being compelled to move because of the way that the climate emergency is just impacting your everyday life and your quality of life.